Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I've never been on this side of these.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa White, CML's Membership Services Manager, welcoming you to today's webinar. We're certainly thrilled to have you join us to talk about technology accessibility for people with disabilities. We think you're going to find this webinar to be extremely informative. Those of you that are elected officials, and if you've registered, you will receive 1 university training credit. So we'll take care of that for you automatically. Today's presentation, the PowerPoint is available on our website at cml.org under training materials. We are also recording today's webinar and we'll post that on the website as well. If you're not familiar with the webinar format, please allow me to just explain a little bit. You should see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. We are muting all of you for the webinar, but at the end, we will encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. At this time, I would like to introduce you to our 2 presenters. Christine McGroarty has an undergraduate degree in psychology and creative writing from Hampshire College and a master's in public administration from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She worked in the budget and management office for the City and County of Denver for 8 years and has been with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment Budget Office for the last 10 years. She serves on several citizen boards for the City of Englewood and is a member of CCCMA. Her other co-presenter is Jim
Pilkington.
Thank you, Pilkington, who is a Colorado native and received a computer science degree from CSU in Fort Collins. He has been an assistive technology director for the Colorado Division of Vocational Rehabilitation in Denver since 2010. And prior to that, he worked as a software test engineer for the Storage Tech Corporation in Louisville, Colorado, and a network administrator for the Boeing Corporation in Wichita, Kansas. So with that, I will turn it over to Christine and Jim. Again, thank you all so much for participating.
Technology accessibility for people with disabilities.
Good afternoon. My name is Christine McGroarty. Thank you, Lisa, for that nice introduction. I am so excited to be here today talking to CML. As Lisa said, I started my career with the City of Denver's budget office, and I'm still pretty involved in my own local government. I love local government, so it's a pleasure to be here today. Again, I work for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's budget office. And Jim?
And this is Jim Pilkington. I'm an assistive technology instructor. I train other blind folks how to use computers, smartphones, other electronic devices.
Presentation overview.
So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. Lisa said we'll have some time at the end to do some questions, but we're going to talk about sort of Jim and my vision for technology accessibility here in Colorado. What is technology accessibility? Why does it matter? What can we do to enhance technology accessibility? And then we have some reference materials at the end of the presentation.
Vision.
And we have in the background, you may hear both Jim and I are blind, and our slides have a little narration on them to keep us on track so we know where we're at. So if you're hearing a little funniness in the background, that's what that is. So our vision is that Colorado be a leader for technology, information, and services for all people, including people with disabilities.
What is technology accessibility for people with disabilities?
So what are we talking about with technology accessibility? We're talking about the ability for all folks, including folks with disabilities, to access peripheral devices, software, systems, all kinds of technology. We'll talk a little later in the presentation about some of the different technology accessibility challenges. But again, we're here talking today about how do we make sure that these technology services and information are available to all folks, including people who access technology in non-standard ways. Both Jim and I use a screen reader to access the computer, and we both have iPhones, which also have a system called VoiceOver. So how are we making these systems accessible for all folks?
Accessibility examples.
So what are we talking about when we talk about accessibility? There's just a couple examples here on the slides of what we're talking about. Jim and I don't use the mouse very much, so accessible equipment can be accessed with the keyboard and keyboard commands, not just the mouse. A lot of times on websites they'll use color to indicate if you made an error in your entry. So if you're using color to indicate that error, then a blind guy will not know that there's an error there. Graphics, there's always the ability to label a graphic, and if developers don't sort of take that opportunity, then when Jim and I are moving across the screen and our screen reader is reading, all it will say is graphic, which isn't very helpful and is quite annoying, actually. And then physical buttons. I've personally, part of where I started this endeavor that has led to this presentation today was noticing the loss of physical buttons. Years ago, I went to buy a DVD player and there were no buttons. iPhones don't have buttons on them anymore. I just had to do a pretty extensive web search to find a new microwave that had physical buttons. So the button thing for me is sort of the most obvious and visible example of what's happening here in the technology realm.
Why is technology accessibility important?
So why is this important? This is both a civil rights issue and a quality of life issue. Technology has really changed the game for folks with disabilities. Jim and I can do the jobs we do today because of accessible technology. We can get access to information that we used to have live readers to get that information to us. Deaf folks can text and can email. They don't have to have live interpreters or specialized equipment anymore. Folks with physical disabilities can manipulate computers through voice activation, so they don't have to manipulate the mouse or the keyboard. So just a couple examples of how this has really been transformative for folks with disabilities.
Why is technology accessibility important?
So again, this question of transformational, and Jim's also going to talk a little bit about the demographics around this issue.
I'm going to do that now. The number of people who need to use accessible technology is really growing. The baby boomer generation, of which I am sort of on the tail end, that demographic is the first one in history that has used computers for the majority of their careers. They've used computers for personal tasks. And just because they're moving into an age range where they're seeing more visual deterioration through macular degeneration or other causes, if you tell that group, well, I'm sorry, you can't access this website, or you can't use the voter machine anymore, the voting machine, just because your eyes are not working the same way they used to, they're not going to take that sitting down. They've nicknamed that group the Silver Tsunami, and it really is appropriate. In government, you quickly come to realize that the folks who are most vocal in the citizenry are retired people, because they have the time and the inclination to let their voices be heard. I believe it's still true that the highest percentage of voter turnout is amongst senior citizens. So if you displease them, they'll let you know about it. So that's one reason why we're really trying to get people ahead of this curve, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it will make our jobs a lot easier in the future dealing with the public.
Why is technology accessibility important? Part 3.
So again, I alluded a little bit ago to this journey started for me when I started noticing the disappearance of physical buttons. It got pretty escalated for me when the state of Colorado decided to get rid of Outlook as its email client and go to Gmail. I'd had some prior experience with Gmail, and I knew that it was not accessible. And I, in my role, not only manage the budget submission for the Department of Public Health, but I am the fiscal note coordinator. So during the legislative session, I literally get hundreds of emails every day. And I knew there was going to be no way that I was going to be able to manage that in the Gmail interface. So I spent a few very uncomfortable months not knowing what my future was. Fortunately, the workaround for blind state employees was that we have been allowed to stay in Outlook and interface to Gmail through Outlook. So big relief that I didn't lose my job and my ability to do my job. But as someone said in another presentation we were doing, luck is not a strategy. And that's what moved both Jim and I to start talking about this issue of technology accessibility.
Yeah, the one personal example that I cite is when I applied for this job as a teacher, I was required to fill out an online employment application, and I went through with my screen reader and filled it out as completely as possible. And just before I hit send, I had a sighted friend take a look at it, and the first thing she said was, "Well, why do you have your birthday in the Social Security field?" Well, because the fields were mislabeled. And I personally know of folks who have had employment applications rejected because they were not filled out properly, because they were not labeled properly. And that really is low-hanging fruit. That's a very easy fix, putting alt text tags on the fields like that. But that's just one example of inaccessibility that would be totally invisible to a sighted user. Unless you're using something like a screen reader, that would fly right past your radar. And that I'll talk a little bit more about why it's so important to have human testing of these things later in the presentation.
And then the last example we want to talk about is back to my conversation about buttons. So I think most of us are moving to those very cool multifunction devices where you send your print job to the printer and you go, and you don't have to worry about people seeing your print job because it doesn't spit it out until you put in your code. Well, think about how many of those machines still have physical buttons. And also the ones that we have in my office, you have to scroll down through a menu and select your name before you can get your print job. So, I personally take a lot of, feel very grateful to be some of the 30% of blind people that are employed. 70% of blind people are unemployed today and have been for probably the last several decades. So I take a lot of pride in my work, and I want to be effective, and I want to be a fully functioning member of the team. And so now I have to go to my colleagues and say, can you print this document for me? And, people may sort of wonder, well, why would a blind person need a print document? But I do presentations. And so, again, my coworkers are sort of responsible for doing the printing whenever we have a presentation. So for me, that's not sort of an ideal scenario.
Yes, we've recently, in the agency I work for, we've had a whole rollout of new telephone desk sets. And when we were briefed on this, we were told, these are great. You'll be able to use all these wonderful functions. And they had a couple of pages, dozens of tasks that you could do that were very high tech with these phones. Well, unfortunately, to access all of those nifty features, you have to use a touch screen. So now I've actually lost the ability to do things like conference calls or forward a call to someone's voicemail or a different number, simply because the touch screen is not accessible. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be made accessible. I'm using an iPhone here to follow along, and the iPhone has very few physical buttons, but because Apple designed it with accessibility as a priority and universal design philosophy, right out of the box, it is good to go. Any blind person with the proper training can pick up an iPhone, anyone's iPhone, turn on the screen reader, and drive it around, make use of 99.9% of the features. The iPhone has been the biggest game changer in assistive technology in the last decade. Pretty much every blind person I know either has an iPhone or wants an iPhone, just for that reason. It's an indispensable device now.
And just as a point of contrast, the screen reader software that Jim and I both use on our big computers, I believe it retails at $1,300. So the difference between buying a device that has the accessibility built right in and having to pay $1,300, which again, since so many blind folks are unemployed, that is a pretty large expenditure. So lots of issues going on here.
Federal requirements for accessibility.
Another reason why this is important is because it's the law. Section 508 prohibits the federal government from doing business with any entity that is not accessible. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically talks about local government services being accessible, and these are all the services that we all know, the city council meetings and agendas. As I said, I'm pretty involved with some of the City of Inglewood stuff, and they've recently changed over to some new web software, and I've struggled a little bit with some of that software, but it's working. And then we all know, Jim mentioned voting earlier, the Help America Vote Act has a lot of provisions in there around accessibility, and just as a little anecdote, I had somebody say to me, you know, what's the big deal? Why don't you just have somebody help you vote? But what if your husband is a Republican and you're a Democrat? You know, so there's some privacy concerns here. There's just some autonomy and dignity and self-respect concerns in this. So very important issue.
Ensuring technology accessibility.
So we've talked a lot about what it is and why it's important. So how do we get there? Technology accessibility actually isn't that difficult. There are standards out there that if you comply with those standards and guidelines, and Jim will talk a little bit more, your things are going to be, for the most part, pretty accessible. Back to the don't have the color red be the only indication of an error. Don't have your label, your graphics be unlabeled. So a lot of these things are pretty readily available, and Jim mentioned the term universal design. There's also a pretty compelling case to be made that when you design for accessibility, it benefits other folks as well.
Absolutely. Most people, when you mention the Americans with Disabilities Act, they think immediately of things like wheelchair ramps or wide doors or grab rails, in the bathroom, and that's a physical accessibility issue. But electronic accessibility really isn't that difficult either. As a former software geek and software tester, the things that catch 99% of the accessibility issues really are pretty simple. So as a software developer, if I'm building a web page or building an application and I want a button on the screen, there's a field when I'm writing the code that says alternate text. And unless you know what that does, you might just leave it blank because the button will work either way. But in the alternate text, if I put a label in there that tells me what the button does, like send or buy now or delete all, then that will be spoken by the screen reader when somebody is using accessible technology. Labeling graphics, thinking about how you design things for universal design, it helps you rethink just the whole information flow of your application or your website, and mostly it's frame of mind. So if you're contracting with a 22-year-old web designer, ask them, well, do you subscribe to universal design? Do you know about the web content accessibility guidelines? That's something we'll refer to later. But in very short order, a developer or someone in procurements can make themselves familiar with this stuff. And once you get it in your head and you start pondering it, it really does get pretty easy for the most part.
Just to follow on that, I was watching a presentation the other day, and the presenter was talking about how, again, to that theme of it benefits everybody when you use universal design. So labeling these graphics and sort of narrating your pictures actually makes it easier for search activities. So it's once you've got that text on there, and similar concept for when you're doing closed captionings for folks with hearing impaired, it makes now your text is searchable. So it makes a richer environment for mining information and data. So to this concept of if you build it in up front, it actually doesn't have to be that difficult. The flip side of that is thinking about the difference between building in your elevator when you build your building and retrofitting your 100-year-old building to put the elevator in. It is much more difficult to fix this than it is to build it in on the front end.
Ensuring technology accessibility continued.
And Jim's going to talk a little bit here about the testing parameters.
Yeah, and whenever you're testing for accessibility, if you just Google the term accessibility testing, or the words blind access, something like that, very generic, you will find multitudes of hits for utilities and tools that will say, we will test your website. Just click here, give us the website address, and we'll check it for accessibility. And those tools, for the most part, are wonderful. They catch the low-hanging fruit. They look for unlabeled graphics. They look for buttons that are unlabeled, things like that. Unfortunately, they don't catch everything, and that's where you need a real human being sitting down, pounding on it. The analogy that I would use is, say you have a toddler, and you want to make sure that your kitchen is safe for the toddler, that the latches on the drawers and the cabinets work. Well, the best way to test that is you install the things and you let a pack of 5-year-olds run amok. The thumb latch that you put on the drawer may be great. It may be, work 100% of the time, but then Timmy decides to use it as a foothold to climb up on the cabinet and it breaks right off. That's the kind of thing you would never, ever catch in theory. It has to be in practice. And that means a live human being in the loop, pounding on it in different ways so that you do get the odd thing that the software developer never, ever thought of. But people do strange stuff. People make mistakes. Once they finish up a section of your questionnaire or your website, maybe they want to change their mind and go back and change the answer to question number 5. And unless you build the form in a good, accessible way, they might not be able to do that.
The state of Colorado recently updated
What can
its.
we do to ensure technology accessibility?
I hit the button too soon. So the state of Colorado recently, not so recently now, updated the financial system, and the folks that built the new financial system clearly had accessibility on their minds. They were clearly aware of it. There's an accessibility help link right there on the main page of the interface. But to Jim's point, somebody missed a place where in the query module where you can only run the query by clicking the mouse. So I, in my role as the budget manager at the state of Colorado's health department, cannot run a query out of the state's financial system. And to the earlier point, so when we talked to the developers about this, they said, oh, we'll fix that in the next upgrade, which is fall of 2018, which now is right around the corner, but 3 years ago was not right around the corner. So building it in up front is really critical, and human testing is also really critical. So what can we do to promote technology accessibility? So the first couple steps are just what we're doing today: build awareness, start to think about accessibility, in all places. Again, it's not just websites, it's telephones and multifunction devices and all kinds of things. And start to give staff some education. As Jim said, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of tools out there. And so it isn't an insurmountable issue. It's just one that people need to give some focus to.
What can we do to ensure technology accessibility continued?
And again, what other actions can we take? I've been doing a lot of reading on the web, and it seems like for so many organizations and entities, having a plan and a policy are critical first steps. So as an organization, what are our values around inclusiveness and accessibility, and how do we take those values and promote them into a plan and a policy? And from that plan and policy, then other things sort of tend to just evolve naturally. Educating our staff, giving our staff tools. There's a couple references at the end where we talk about some third-party vendors. There are experts in this area of technology accessibility who can assist. So lots of tools out there.
What can we do to ensure technology accessibility?
So as I've been thinking about this issue for the past probably 6 years, this has been front of mind for me, and I feel like procurement is the place to start. If you're building it into your design, if you're building it into your RFPs and your RFIs, if you're building it into your evaluation of your vendors, then you're really taking a huge step toward ensuring that your things are going to be accessible. Again, all things, telephones, computers, financial systems, all kinds of, every piece. A lot of times people joke, I heard somebody talking the other day about why the camera feature on the iPhone doesn't need to be accessible. Why would a blind person need to take a picture? Well, I know some blind folks who, before they get in the lift, they take a picture of the license plate. So, so when you think about it, why would a blind person?
That's brilliant.
The big joke is, why do you have Braille on the ATM at the drive-up window, right? That's another thing that people laugh about. But sometimes people that don't have cars walk up to the drive-up ATM, or sometimes they're in a Lyft or an Uber and they're doing their transaction, their financial transaction. So it's really important when we're talking about this not to sort of be limited in terms of this kind of person wouldn't ever need to do this kind of thing. Jim wants to be able to do a conference call, and I want to be able to print my documents, even though I actually can't read them, but my audience can read them.
Yep. And a lot of accessibility features don't start necessarily as accessibility features. The compass on the iPhone. I know of people who use that, blind folks who use that so that they can get lined up on a crosswalk in a big intersection, because most people, when they're walking for any more than about 10 feet, it's hard to stay on a heading. It's hard to walk in a straight line. Close your eyes and walk across a field, and you'll see just how much you drift. And so by just holding the iPhone and getting a reading, it's 57 degrees. As long as I keep it within a couple of degrees of that, I can cross an 8-lane intersection easily. The camera feature, we now have the ability on a self-contained handheld device like an iPhone to take a picture of a page of text and have that converted into electronic text that can be read to us using the screen reader. So a lot of these features may not seem like they're accessible related, but people find a lot of quirky uses for these that may not be apparent at the beginning.
Conclusion.
So in conclusion, thank you so much for your attention today and thinking about this issue. It's a critical issue. It's a critical issue for our citizens around civil rights and quality of life, and very important. With accessibility, we're ensuring that all citizens have equal access to services and information that we in government are providing. Again, toward the end here, we have a couple pages of reference materials, and hopefully those could be of use. And thank you so much for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you. Fantastic information. I hope everyone really enjoyed it and was able to get some great tips and insights from our presenters. So at this time, if you have any questions, feel free to write them into the question box at this time. I'll be happy to read those out. Just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. Go to cml.org under training materials. We'll get that posted hopefully probably tomorrow. So you can share this link and the webinar itself with anyone who wasn't able to participate, or if you wanted to listen to it and watch it again. Someone did make a comment, Tuggy Dunton. Tuggy, we appreciate your feedback tremendously. Tuggy is from the town of Ignacio. She says, thank you, Jim and Christine, for presenting this so clearly and without underlying bitterness or anger. It was easy to listen to you, educational and enjoyable. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you, Tuggy. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Feel free to write them in there. And I'm sure that Jim and Christine would be available anytime afterward if you have any follow-up questions as well. Thank you for sharing this information. Can you please tell me where to find the laws required municipal accessibility requirements? Having the legal requirements will help me share the needs for this with my town. And that's from Emily. Emily, thank you so much. Emily is from the town of Mountain View. So Jim or Christine?
I actually have a copy of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I could make that available to Lisa, and she could post it on the website. I think we did not in this version, but we also had a link to the federal 508 compliance law, so we could share that with Lisa as well.
Great.
And there is this doesn't apply to the municipalities, but there is a state statute that does address directly visual access or access for the blind to state systems and computers. We could probably include that also. That might have some language that could be of use.
Absolutely, sure. Happy to do that. So we'll make that available in the same area as this linked to the recording of the webinar. Final few minutes for questions if there are any. I have to mention we will be announcing and actually have announced our district meetings coming up. CML will be hitting the road, visiting with many of your cities and towns around the state, September and October. So if you go to cml.org under outreach, you'll see that list of locations. We're going to be real busy traveling and we can't wait to visit with you. So please see if any of those meetings nearby where you're located work with your schedules to join us. Those meetings have a business component as well as a social hour and dinner, so a little bit of fun as well. Any other final questions? Give you another minute or two. I think that your presentation was so thorough that everyone is just digesting everything. So
well, and to follow on what you said, we're happy to answer questions about this. So I believe our telephone numbers are included in the presenters page at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So feel free to bounce questions off of us. We both make use of this, and we're both, I think, pretty diligent about getting back with people who contact us.
We sure appreciate that. Absolutely. CML is passionate about making resources available to our members, and I know that having you all available to answer questions and provide insight is another valuable tool that we have. Okay, folks. Well, with that, I do want to thank you all so much for your time today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your summer. Be in touch if we can help with anything. Thanks so much.